Hello, everybody, and welcome to week one of Philosophy 307, Philosophy of Law. Let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. All right. So, week one, we're going to talk about a question that is in some ways central to the philosophy of law, namely, why not break the law? It's a question that goes back to Socrates, obviously, which is why Socrates is on screen. Um, and it's found in Crito, which is a dialogue that Plato recorded from Socrates after his trial. So it's important to give a little bit of background. Um, Socrates is in jail, having lost a trial. He was put on trial by the ancient Athenians for corrupting the youth, is how they put it. Socrates was about 2,000 years ago, considered by many to be the father of Western philosophy. He was originally in the infantry in the army as a youth and eventually became a stonemason. When he got older, he was 70 something when they executed him. When he got older, he became a philosopher. The word philosopher actually comes from the Greek word philosophia, which means lover of wisdom. And one of the ways he exhibited that was to go around asking people difficult, complicated, and sometimes embarrassing questions. Like, what is the nature of justice? What is the nature of mercy? What is the nature of truth? How do you know something? And he would ask very probing, difficult questions in order to see whether or not someone knew something. There's a classic case classic dialogue where he waits in front of the courthouse in downtown Athens and asks lawyers and judges as they come in and out what justice is and just eviscerates their answers one after the other. So Socrates would talk to just about anybody who talked to him. He talked to slaves, he talked to judges, politicians, bureaucrats, soldiers, farmers, etc. Um, but he wasn't very popular as a result because he asked difficult questions. He was in some ways the first philosophical troll. So because of this, the Athenians put him on trial and found him guilty and let him choose his own form of execution. Socrates chose death by hemlock. It's the substance that killed off one of the whisperers in The Walking Dead example. But it's a natural plant that grows. It's toxic, and if you add it to something, it can kill you pretty effectively. Um, so we then come into the scene. This is where our discussion starts with Crito, who is a friend of Socrates, who has lots of money and power and influence, who's trying to convince Socrates to flee prison to escape. Crito informs Socrates he has lots of money and he can bribe the guards, and he has friends in other Greek city-states that will allow Socrates to flee there. Socrates, however, refuses, and so Crito wants to give him some arguments for breaking the law and escaping. So Crito's basically asking, should Socrates flee prison to escape his unjust punishment? And a lot of emphasis is placed on the word unjust. Socrates, in Crito's mind, and I agree with Crito, I think the ancient Athenians were assholes, at least from the records that we have. It looks like Socrates was killed or executed because he was a pain in the ass. He annoyed people, he asked difficult questions, and it was just easier to get rid of him than to answer these questions. So like I always tell students, they didn't kill Socrates for nothing. There was there were reasons for it. I just don't think they're morally sound reasons, and neither did Crito. So his four reasons for escaping are as follows. First, he thinks the majority will think ill of Socrates and his friends if he does not escape. This has to do with the fact that people will often take your actions as evidence of what you really think or believe or who you really are. So in this particular case, the ancient Athenians may look at Socrates in action and take that as more evidence that in fact Socrates was corrupting the youth and his punishment is just. This is sloppy thinking. It has some basis in truth, but it can be taken too far. Sometimes people's actions can indicate their preferences and beliefs, and other times not. So we have to be very careful. For example, asking people how often they go to church in a poll. At least 20 years ago, maybe this has changed, but about 20 years ago, people would inflate how often they went to church because they saw going to church as a good thing. But there's other research techniques or other methods where you can ask people other questions and just see that they actually don't go to church as much as they claim. So it's important to realize that uh, what the message people will take away from something isn't always obvious. But Crino thinks, hey, the majority will just think ill of Socrates and his friends by extension. They're going to think ill of me, Crito's going to say to Socrates, because I'm helping you. Doesn't that just affirm that they've executed for good reasons? They were justified in doing so. His second argument is, I think, probably his best one and the most straightforward. Since the court was wrong, it shouldn't be obeyed. And this intuition that Crino is appealing to here is going to be one that we explore more in weeks 2 and 3. Namely, what constitutes a law? Some in the natural law theory tradition think, hey, a law is only a law insofar as it's a just law. Unjust laws are not laws. They are forms of coercion and control, to be sure, and they will be enforced, obviously. Unjust laws are enforced by unjust governments all the time, but it's not a law per se. It's not a proper law. This would be like thinking a car that has been in a collision and has been totaled is not really a car anymore. It resembles a car. It used to be a car. It has many of the same features of a car, but it's not a car. For one thing, cars are able to drive, and a car that's totaled, not so much. Crino thinks the same thing applies to laws. He just thinks, well, the court erred, so the law doesn't apply. Laws only apply insofar as they're just. That is a minimum requirement. Um, Crino also thinks that the welfare of Socrates' children requires this escape. Presumably his children and grandchildren at this point, because Socrates is in his 70s, care about Socrates and they care about his welfare. Even if they're not very close to Socrates, they probably don't want something horrible to happen to him. So, in terms of the mental and emotional welfare of his children, this is a reason for Socrates to escape. And finally, Crino thinks, hey, look, dude, death is an evil to be avoided. You've been convicted of an unjust crime or by an unjust law or by an unjust jury. You've been given the sentence of execution, and we typically think you should try and prolong life as long as possible. Now, if you're, in excruciating pain or there are some sort of special circumstances, then no, maybe not. But insofar as Socrates was in relatively good health still, and he still had his frame of mind about him, he's still very sharp. This just seems like you're killing yourself. It's a waste. What a waste of extra life. And death just looks like an evil. It deprives you of more life. To die is to be deprived of an opportunity to continue to live. And insofar as that can be avoided, it should be. So these are the four arguments that Crito and really the friends of Socrates try to give him to convince him, like, to escape. Why voluntarily execute yourself? Like, why voluntarily go along with this execution when it really would not be that hard to escape? Socrates, however, is not convinced by any of this, because of course not. This is part of the reason why they wanted to kill him in the first place. So Socrates has a reply to Crito, a number of replies. So one of them is that he thinks the majority opinion is relevant only if it's true. So Crito makes a big deal about the majority opinion, and critics will often say, like, look, the jury came to this judgment. It was a jury's Athenian juries were huge. They were like 100, 200 people. Unlike American juries, which have 10 to 12 jurors and then two alternates. So it's a much smaller group. Juries in ancient Greece were huge. So one of the arguments that people would often give is that Socrates is rightly convicted, and we know that because the majority decided on it, the group. They got together, they put their heads together, they exhibited what philosophers and economists call the wisdom of the crowds, which is this idea that there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge contained and distributed across large groups of people. This is why you can get great information from prediction markets, polls, insofar as they're done properly and incentivized properly. And you can also get phone a friend or polling the audience on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and these game shows. What they're doing is taking advantage of the wisdom of the crowds. There's a lot of wisdom in groups that's distributed. And often wisdom of the crowds can even beat experts because there's so much wisdom in the group that collectively it knows more than an individual expert does. Now, as a group of experts against wisdom of the crowds, not as much. But even then, sometimes wisdom of the crowd still beats groups of experts. And this is one of the arguments for democracy, that people vote, and in the process of voting in large nations where people are allowed to freely cast votes, good policy comes out of that. I don't think the theory works, but that's the theory. So what Socrates is really doing is a rejection of relativism. What he's saying is that majorities don't make something might, or like might doesn't make right, majorities don't make right. Some things are just or unjust independently of what the majority thinks. So that's very abstract. Here's an example. Imagine World War II had turned out very, very differently. Now, this is an example that Socrates is going to use, obviously, because World War II happened thousands of years after he was dead. But it's one he could have used. So the Allies lose, the Axis powers win, and the Nazis convert the Imperial Japanese into Nazism, and eventually the world is majority Nazi. And they believe a lot of what we consider to be morally odious things about Jewish folks and other minority groups, and be perfectly fine with all kinds of horrible um, policies to deal with these folks, to put it that way. I take it that in the world where the Allies lost and the Nazis prevailed and were the majority, that fact alone wouldn't make Nazism morally correct. Nazism would still be unjust, it would still be immoral, and it would still be wrong. The mere fact that a bunch of people think something in and of itself does not change it. Another way to think about this is that morality is a lot like mathematics. And by that I mean, it seems to be wholly independent of what people think of it. 2 plus 2 equals 4, regardless of whether or not I want it to or like it. And some things are just wrong. Torturing people for fun, for example, would just be wrong independently of what any particular person happens to think about it. So the changing of the minds, the fact that the majority in and of itself thinks one thing rather than another, is Socrates doesn't think very convincing. So what? And if you think morality is just a factor of what people think, well, then you should just move your moral beliefs based on what the polling says. Just keep changing it. Right? Just check in with polls. So you may or may not agree with relativism, and you may or may not agree with Socrates, but this is Socrates' response in part to Crito. But it goes deeper than that. So Socrates actually thinks, hey, look, my children are actually going to be better off if I take the hemlock and die than if I'm exiled to a different Greek city-state. So why is that? Well, suppose Socrates flees. His rich friends bribe the guards. He flees Athens. Maybe he goes to Sparta. Sort of joking here, but suppose he goes to Sparta. And the Athenians find out about it. Presumably, there's a decent chance they'll, if nothing else, harass, harangue, and maybe hurt, torture, kill Socrates' children and his extended family in an effort to get Socrates to come back and face his punishment. There's any number of ways that his children and grandchildren and extended family and friends could be used as leverage against Socrates. So he thinks, look, it's not clear to me that they would be better off. Um, he also doesn't know whether or not, or doesn't think he knows whether or not death is actually an evil. So Crito is saying that you should flee the prison, man, because like I can just bribe the guard and get you out of here. And don't you want to prolong death as long as possible? You're relatively in good health still. You have your wits about you. You're not dying of cancer or something. Don't we want to prolong death as much as possible? To which Socrates says, well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't prolong death as long as possible, but that in and of itself doesn't make it an evil. So Socrates has a view something like Lucretius or Epicurus, 2 other ancient Greek philosophers that we aren't going to talk much about, but what if we were doing an ancient philosophy class? And Lucretius and Epicurus basically just think it doesn't make a lot of sense to be afraid of death. For the same reason, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be afraid of the time before your birth. Many things happened in the world, in the universe, long before you were ever thought of. Your parents were thought of, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., etc. In fact, in Socrates' day, it was thousands of years before you'd be born, if you're listening to this lecture right now. You didn't know anything about it. You were completely clueless. You didn't exist to know about it. So that wasn't a problem. It wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't an evil. It just was. So when you die, if you cease to exist, and that's just the end of you, then how is that any worse than before you came to be? It's seemingly strange to call it an evil, is what Socrates is going to say. You may not like it. You may want to extend your life. That's fine. But that's not the same thing as calling it an evil. So Socrates is just not buying this. Now, Crito is on one end of the debate over death. It's still going to this day, I might add. And Socrates is on the other end. So Socrates is a Lucretius, Epicurus type about death. And you're going to find those to this day. Actually, friends with a couple of them. Some were even in the department at ASU. And then there's others who view death like Socrates, or excuse me, like Martin Fisher or others. It's called the deprivation view of death. And it says that death is a deprivation. It's a bad thing. It's a very, very bad thing. In fact, it is evil. So something along the lines of Crito, saying death is an evil because it deprives us. Sort of like murder is evil. Murder is evil because it deprives the person of their future and any good in it without good reason. So the hugs and kisses and laughter and family and travel and vacations and lattes and awesome music and dancing and all of the beautiful things that would be in the person's life, you've stolen that away by murdering them. And death does the same thing. But so we have the split in philosophy. It's funny that it occurs at the very beginning of philosophy and it continues to this day. So Socrates just doesn't buy that death is an evil. It may be unfortunate, but it's not an evil on his view. And finally, um, Socrates does not think civil disobedience is just. This idea that you resist an unjust state or an unjust law by breaking it, often peacefully. So it's disobedience, it's civil, it's not uncivil, but you're breaking the law. You're doing something that is illegal, that has been prohibited by the law, and you're doing it knowingly. So Socrates just thinks, um, if you're Gandhi or Martin Luther King, you're doing something wrong. So why does Socrates oppose civil disobedience? Um, he has this weird argument where he thinks that insofar as he's been an Athenian citizen his whole life, he was born in Athens. He lived in Athens until his early 70s. He thinks by the act of staying there, being born there, staying there, and not leaving, up to this point, is an implicit contract with Athens. When you stay in Athens and you stick around, you don't leave, especially, what you're doing is implicitly promising to obey all laws. Um, because they're originating from the state. They come from a process of legislating and voting, because remember, Athens is a democracy. But more importantly, Socrates would say, if you're an Athenian citizen and you've been here your whole life, you've benefited from the laws, you've benefited from the stability, you've benefited from the economy, from other citizens, etc. You benefited from the protections and laws of the state up to this point. So why do you get to change the deal now? Um, so Socrates thinks if everybody did this, if everybody just obeyed the law until they didn't like obeying the law anymore or they didn't like the result, we wouldn't have laws anymore. We wouldn't have governments. We wouldn't have societies. Things would be much more unstable. Um, it's not clear. So Socrates just has this very strong view that if you live in a society for a long period of time, you don't really try and change it and you don't leave it. What you're implicitly doing is endorsing it. Unless you're a hypocrite or you think the society, everyone should be allowed to do this. It's not like, this is straight up hypocrisy. You are living by standards until you don't like them. Socrates thinks that's something akin to hypocrisy. And it also doesn't really work insofar as if everybody did that, if everybody in Athens were to leave or disobey the law anytime they didn't like it, there wouldn't be an Athens. So Socrates is making an appeal to arbitrariness. He's saying, if I were to escape, it's arbitrary in a way that would be detrimental to society. Now, I don't buy this argument, neither does Crito. And I think someone like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X type, someone who's trained philosophically, um, looks at it a little differently, would rightly say something like, insofar as the laws are just, Socrates, that's correct. So it wouldn't make sense to flee a society that was wholly just. It wouldn't make sense to try and undercut, undermine, or disobey laws that were wholly just. Because to disobey a just law is wrong. So if you're disobeying a just law, then you're doing something wrong. I think Socrates is absolutely right about that. is what, yeah, I think I would say the same thing. But maybe Socrates is right and his critics are wrong. But he also has another sort of odd argument for sticking around. It's related, it's not really related to philosophy of law directly, but it's sort of an indication of Socrates' thinking, I think, and how he approaches these sorts of questions. But he thinks that this is sort of the final act of his life, and it's sort of putting on the finishing touches, like you might do with a like he uses a painting as an example. But it's an indication, where it's a sign of finality, sort of like getting a driver's license used to be more of a rite of passage. I think that's beginning to change. Fewer people drive and fewer people want to drive. But I'm in my 40s, and growing up, it was a rite of passage. I'm a millennial, older millennial. Um, but it was definitely like a sign that you had reached or were approaching adulthood. And Socrates seems to think that his final, like he's been condemned by the government or by the state, a jury of his peers, a big jury of his peers, to be condemned to death. And he thinks this is just, it's like the final, it's like your dying act, it's the final brushstroke, it's the finishing touch, it's the cherry on top of the sundae. Um, he thinks living too long can be bad too. So this is sort of like going out on a high note. He's still relatively healthy. He still has his wits about him. And he just thinks, this is a finishing touch. Um, this is interesting insofar as it is revealing about Socrates' personality and temperament. But I do think the more interesting argument, and one that we will indirectly be examining over the next couple of weeks as we talk about what the law is and what punishment does. Um, I think Socrates' argument that he's made an implicit contract with Athens by sticking around up until this point, from birth until now, is a bit strong. But maybe I'm wrong. After all, philosophy is about the love of wisdom, not about agreement. Maybe you disagree. If so, say so in your discussion post.